the British Commonwealth's highest award for gallantry in the face of the enemy. I'm not sure there's ever been an award more justified in terms of what his actions were. And what just absolutely blows me away with this story is that the rescue axe that Winarski used to try to save Pat Brophy is that one right there, that exact axe. That's not representative, that's not symbolic, that is the axe. Because after the Lancaster crashed, some local French civilians went into the wreck. They found the axe and thought, hey, this is kind of cool, we're going to take it with us. They brought it home, and decades later, two of Winarski's other crewmen that survived the crash went to visit these French villagers who also helped to get them away to safety. And they said, oh, by the way, we have this axe, and I thought maybe you'd want to have it. So they brought it back to Canada. They donated it to 419 Squadron that are based out in Cold Lake, and it now sits in either the Squadron's museum or in the Cold Lake Museum itself. Absolutely remarkable. And his actual Victoria Cross is deposited with the museum in Winnipeg. So that's another of the objects, sort of a bonus for us today. The picture on the left is a statue that's in Bibby Park in Winnipeg that is commemorating the act of Andy crouching down. He's got the axe in his hand, trying to save his friend. And on the right is pretty much the entire crew as it went out on that day. Winarski is in the center, right there, and this dapper dude is Pat Brophy, who I found out settled after the war in Thunder Bay. I was just up there giving a similar talk to this, and I said, I'm sorry, I don't have any objects in my book that are specifically from Thunder Bay, and they said, oh, but Pat Brophy settled here, so that's good enough for us. So I succeeded even when I didn't know I was going to. All right, this is a bit of a weird photograph because of the way the object is sitting and the way the photograph was taken. It's actually a ring made out of acrylic or plexiglass, and just the way it's sitting in the holder, kind of lost the bottom of it. But it is a proper ring, and on the front of it you can see there's two initials, V and S. And turned out that was for Verna Stronach, who is this lady right here, who grew up and lived her entire life just outside of the airbase in Greenwood, Nova Scotia. And I wish I had a photo of her from the war. This is a photo from much later in her life. But she was 15 during the war, same age as my daughter now, actually, which is kind of interesting. But during the war, Hudson bombers were training at, or transport aircraft were training at Greenwood. And in June, on one day, two young men, one a Brit and one an Australian, went out for a training flight, and they never came back. The plane crashed soon after takeoff, and both of them were killed in the crash. Well, the crash aircraft stayed in the field for quite a long time before it was taken out of there, and Verna and her friends used to cycle up to the crash site just to see what was going on. And they made good friends with some of the men who were guarding that wreck, because there was always at least one and usually a few airmen that were guarding the wreck. And I think it was all pretty innocent. I don't think anything was really going on, but one of the airmen took a liking to Verna, and after he was posted back to England, in the mail, she received this ring along with a letter that said that he had carved it in his spare time from a piece of the plexiglass windshield that he had rescued from the crashed aircraft. And it was something she treasured all her life and eventually donated to the museum in Greenwood. And I absolutely love this artifact because in and of itself, it's just an old ring that's not valuable except for the story it tells of a young girl and her wartime experience, because the RCAF didn't affect just the men flying planes or the men fixing the planes, but it affected the families around the air bases and the men and women and their families that were impacted by the war in different ways than actually being out on the front lines. And I think Verna's story is really representative of that. It's just a crash card for that Lockheed Hudson that was shot down 25th of June 1942, and it was Pilot Officer Blick from Australia and Flight Sergeant Nettleton Hopkinson from the RAF, who both didn't survive that wreck. Again, two men that died in training. I wish their stories were easy, but they're not. Don't actually know off the top of my head, but it's around 20% of all fatalities in the Air Force on flying operations were in training. This is a felt hat made in Poland, of all places. And if you look at it, it looks almost brand new, doesn't it? Looks like you could just go out and pick it up and throw it on, and it would be in great shape. Well, it belongs to this guy, Joseph Green, who was a aviation mechanic, air systems mechanic in 426 Squadron, Dakota Transport Squadron that was in Burma. And that's, Gordon Green was his name. Gordon's on the left and his brother Jim is on the right, and somehow they both joined up at different times, but ended up serving in the same squadron and were both deployed to Burma for the duration of the war and served side by side. And I like this object because it is from one of the ERCs, as they were called. The men who serviced the planes, repaired the planes, fixed the planes. 426 Squadron was particularly notable because of all the transport squadrons in Burma and Southeast Asia, flying what they call the hump up and over the Himalayas to get stuff to the British forces and Indian forces in India fighting the Japanese. 426 was the most effective, carried more tonnage of supplies than any other transport squadron, British, Canadian, or American. And it really shows the dedication of the air crew and the ground crew to make this happen. The squadron talks about the fact that the men had a pact amongst themselves that during downtime they would forsake hot meals and just eat cold rations so they could get back to work quicker and get the aircraft turned around, unloaded, fixed up, and ready for the next mission. The 426 Squadron, also with their engines, Dakota usually took about 3 days to swap out an engine if there was a problem. 426 Squadron could do it in 2 days. So you can see the big impact that would have on the pace of operations. And Gordon Green and his brother Jim were two of the men that did that. And I love that photo of Gordon on the right. He was a young entrepreneur. In his spare time, which there couldn't have been too much of it, he built a washing machine and he built a business, and he did the laundry for anybody who would pay him to do it. And I just think that's absolutely wonderful. So that's him at his homemade washing machine. These are baby booties, which is like, come on, why do we have baby booties in a book on the RCAF? Well, it turns out they were worn by a very famous Canadian airman, that guy right there, who would go on to be squadron leader Ernie McNabb, the commander of the 1st Canadian Fighter Squadron to fly and fight in the war against Fritz. Ernie was known as Pee-wee. I don't know if you can tell from that photo, but he wasn't a man of great stature. He was about 5'4" or 5'5". But everyone started somewhere, and I don't know why these baby booties were saved. I don't know how they ended up at the Air Force Museum of Alberta in Calgary, but they came in with his donation, and I think it's just absolutely wonderful to remember that these men who fought and died in these wars overseas were once babies and have a story behind them to tell. They grew up with families, they went to school, they got bullied or sometimes maybe were bullies. McNabb thought that he was going to be a lawyer, graduated university, went to law school, but then decided the Air Force was his calling. So he dropped out of law school, went into the RCAF, and at the start of the Second World War, he was a squadron commander, but he had no experience, so he took a posting with a British squadron during the Battle of Britain and flew some missions to sort of learn what aerial combat was like. Subsequently was posted back to number 1 Canadian Fighter Squadron and flew during the Battle of Britain, commanding a very successful squadron of Canadians. McNabb would end up having 5 credited victories during the Battle of Britain, so he was an ace, very effective commander and pilot. You can see in this picture, this is McNabb here in the center. He's kind of short, but a pit bull and a really good leader, the kind of leader that men would fight and die for. And he ended up staying in the Air Force right through the war, although after serving with 1 Canadian squadron, he went back to Canada, where he led a bunch of training bases to teach fighter pilot tactics and help the next round of pilots become effective and efficient. We also have his tunic that you can see has the wings and that stripe decoration right there is the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the higher awards for flying in combat that was awarded to airmen. In 1948, Canada won 2 gold medals in the Winter Olympics. Who knows what those were? This is a really good guess on here.
I think it's hockey.
Hockey is one. Yes.
Barbara and Scott.
Barbara and Scott, very good.
Yeah,
Figure skating was the other one. But it was the RCAF Flyers, an amateur hockey team put together that, against all odds, won the gold medal for Canada in St. Moritz, Switzerland. And this is actually, took me a long time to figure this out because, anyway, I'll get to that in a second. This is a jersey worn in a 1968 charity game by the team that they wore, that was worn by one of the guys that won the gold medal. But on the right is his actual gold medal. And that is the guy with his jersey on, Red Gravel, who actually scored about 3 goals during the Olympics and was a key figure on the team. But it's a really remarkable story, something that could not happen today. And when I tell you the story, you're going to be blown away. Canada didn't have a team for the 1948 Olympics. Somehow, and I can't remember his name, there was an RCAF officer who learned this and decided, wouldn't it be wonderful if we entered an RCAF team in the Olympics? So he ran it up the chain. He talked to Brooke Claxton, the Minister of Defense. He talked to the Chief of the Air Staff. Again, I can't remember his name right now. He talked to the Canadian Olympic Committee, and within 24 hours, he had approval to put together a Canadian RCAF team. He scoured the country. He found players from coast to coast who were almost exclusively either current or former members of the RCAF, brought them to Toronto. They trained, they practiced, and they were the laughing stock of Olympic hockey teams. They lost every single one of their exhibition games, and there was some talk that, well, maybe we shouldn't send these guys because they're just going to be a national embarrassment. Well, they got over to Switzerland, and somehow the script changed. They won every game, almost every game. In the final game, they had to win by 2 goals, and they won by 3, and they ended up winning the Olympic gold for Canada, the RCAF Flyers, which is really such an amazing story, and the quintessential Canadian story with hockey and the Air Force.
Who did they beat?
I was looking at they beat the Czechs. The Czechs were the Czechoslovakian team were the favorites, and they beat them in the second to last game. And I forget who it was that they actually beat in the final game, but I think it might have been the home team actually, Switzerland. But don't quote me on that part of it. So this is the photograph of the team in 1968 that they were doing a charity game, and they had the new jerseys. This is Red Gravel right there, second from the right, wearing the jersey that is now in the museum in Trenton, the National Air Force Museum of Canada. And if you look right here, that's Gravel there in 1948 in a photo that was taken just after they had clinched the gold medal.
Hot gold, that gets you right there, right?
can't underestimate those goaltenders.
I think they were sandbagging them to use solution. Build up the cage.
That's it. Yeah, just make them underestimate you.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So this is a beat-up Hun flying helmet from the First World War. We're stepping back a little bit. And again, you're wondering, how does this fit into an RCAF story? Well, in a couple of different ways. But it's connected to this guy here. Anybody know who he is? No, didn't think so. Air Chief Marshal, eventually, Lloyd Redner, who became the Chief of the Air Staff, the senior officer in the RCAF during the Second World War. Really important role in the development and the way the Air Force was fought during the Second World War. During the First World War, he served in the Royal Naval Air Service. He learned to fly with the Wright brothers, went down on his own dime to Ohio to learn to fly on a Wright flyer. I've got a picture of that coming up. Joined the Royal Naval Air Service because at the time the air services didn't teach you to fly. You already had to have your pilot's ticket to join a flying service. So he did that on his own, joined the Royal Naval Air Service, flew over the Western Front, first in Sopwith pups and eventually Sopwith camels. And during one of his missions, he was up by himself and he spotted a German Gotha bomber, not the one on the right, but the same type, big bomber. They were fast, they were tough to shoot down, they were tough to find, and at the time the Germans were using them to bomb England, and it was a really big problem. Redner happened to be up on a flight and saw this bomber come close. Took him about 25 minutes to catch up to it, but he finally caught up to it, and then had a long fight with it because it was almost too fast for him to stay with, and he would sort of get up to it, he'd spray it with bullets, fall back, have to get back into position again. Didn't do any damage to the crew, but he managed to damage both engines to the point where the bomber eventually had to set down or it was going to crash. And fortunately, it set down behind the front line in Allied territory. All three crew members survived. And of course, what do you do at the time? Well, you go down and you land beside the aircraft you just shot down because you want a trophy. And that's what Redner did. He found out by the time he got there that the, I think it was French soldiers had captured the 3 pilots, so he went and tried to talk to them. Well, they spoke German, he spoke English, didn't work out very well. But he did come away with this helmet and took his knife out and cut the Iron Cross off the side of the fuselage and brought it back to the squadron mess as well. But this helmet was one of his most treasured possessions. He carried it around with him for the rest of his life, had it proudly displayed in his office, and when he passed on, he gave it to willed it to his grandson, and then his grandson subsequently gave it to the Air Force Museum in Comox, BC, where it tells a wonderful story about Redner. The photo on the top right is one from later in the war, where Redner is in a Sopwith camel with his flying helmet on. This one is taken before the war, and that's a young Redner learning to fly on a Wright flyer in Ohio, which is really quite remarkable. I don't know how anybody would ever want to go up in those things. Like, it just took a different breed of person to want to fly in something that was held together by, I don't know, not much more than duct tape as far as I'm concerned. So, a beat up old suitcase. This is probably the object that I'm most proud of teasing the story of, because when it was sent to me, I looked at it and I'm like, what the hell do you want me to do with this? Like, there's no story that will make this a useful story. And I almost ignored it. And then I started sort of enlarging some photos of it on my computer, and I noticed there's writing all over it. You can see there's a name up here. There's a Spitfire that's drawn here. There's all sorts of names on it. So I started looking into those names and discovered it's connected to this man, RCAF pilot named Flight Sergeant Jack Davey. And his story is absolutely remarkable. It's his leather suitcase, it's the trunk that he carried around with him. He joined the Air Force in Alberta, learned to fly fighters, was eventually posted over to the UK into a British, actually a couple of British fighter squadrons, RAF squadrons, flew operations out of England over the continent, what were known as intruder missions, where fighter squadrons were sent over to try to shoot up German bases or support bombers and things like that. Eventually, he was then posted over to North Africa, joined number 112 Squadron, RAF, flying the Kitty Hawk. And I think I have a picture of the Kitty Hawk for you. Whoops, there. I'll come back to the other one in a second. That's him sitting on the wing of his Kitty Hawk in the desert. But in 1942, he flew one mission with 112 Squadron that was successful, came back. A few days later, went on another mission, and he never came back. And he was lost on the mission. Nobody knew what happened, not even his squadron mates. They didn't see what happened. They didn't know if he'd been shot down, if he had a mechanical issue and had to put down in the desert somewhere. His mother was looking for the story and wrote the squadron commander, and the squadron commander, I've got a copy of the letter, wrote back to her and said, "Oh, don't worry too much about Jack. He's a fighter. I'm sure he just had some issue and landed. And we're going to hear from him soon. Either he's going to walk into camp one day after a really exciting ordeal in the desert, or he's going to send us a letter from a German POW camp just saying he's safe and sound." Well, it turns out he wasn't safe and sound. We still don't know to this day what happened to him. He probably got hit by a German flak while he was attacking a German position in Tobruk in Libya. And the best guess is that he got shot down and crashed in the desert, and that was it. But to this day, we've never found his plane, we've never found his body, we don't know what happened. He was just lost. By some remarkable stroke of luck, his possessions were sent back to his family. They were packed into 2 suitcases. One was the suitcase I showed you. The other one had most of the valuables. He had a bunch of Rolex watches he'd acquired, some other stuff. Those disappeared. They never made it back to his family. Somebody probably repurposed them, shall we say. But this suitcase got back, and it is absolutely remarkable in the story it tells, because it's the equivalent of a high schooler's yearbook, in that it details every part of his career. He put the name of every base he was posted to on it. So all of the places where he did his enlistment and training, where he went down his passage to England, Reykjavik, and Greenock, Scotland, etc. He's got his postings in the UK, Bournemouth, in Wales, and Essex, and so forth. He then took what was known as the Takoradi route over to his posting in Libya. And this is a fascinating story in itself. The British couldn't sail through the Mediterranean at that point because it was a sort of a German-Italian lake and it was too dangerous. So what they did to get aircraft and airmen to Egypt was they would sail down the west coast of Africa and disembark at Takoradi, or like Jack did probably in Freetown in West Africa. And then they would hopscotch across the entire continent of Africa from airbase to airbase. It would usually be a twin-engine aircraft that had a navigator that would lead a flight of 6 or 12 single-engine fighters. They would go as far as the fighters' fuel would allow them to go. They'd set down, rest, refuel, eat, and then carry on. And he's got all his stops along the way. Takoradi, Makurdi, Khartoum, and finally Cairo, which is quite remarkable. And then he's got the postings with 112 Squadron. So it's just fascinating. And then you keep looking deeper, and there's a whole bunch of signatures on it of his buddies that he flew with. And it'll be their signatures. Some you can read, some you can't. And their hometown. And they're from Canada, they're from Wales, they're from Scotland, they're from Australia and South Africa. And it's just such an amazing story that all comes from this beat-up old suitcase. Like, who would have thunk it? It's a caterpillar. Why might an Air Force person have a caterpillar pin? Parachute. Silk, exactly. Caterpillars make silk. Silk makes parachutes. if you had to use your parachute to survive a crashing aircraft, you were awarded a Caterpillar pin by the company that made parachutes. And this one happened to be owned by Keith Skeet Ogilvy, who was another Canadian fighter pilot. Also flew during the Battle of Britain. Ended up flying those same intruder missions that Jack Jagey was doing, except he didn't come back from one of the missions. He got shot down over France, ended up being taken prisoner, and wouldn't you know it, he ended up in a German prison camp known as Stalag Luft 3. The Great Escape, exactly. He was one of the great escapers. He was integral to the planning committee. He helped to dig the tunnel, and he was one of the last guys to get out of the tunnel during that great escape. By some even more remarkable stroke of luck, he survived. He was on the lam for about 3 days, was finally recaptured by the Germans, but fortunately he wasn't one of the 50 that were executed as a signal to the rest of the men not to do these things. So he spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp, came back to Canada after the war, and those were a couple of photos. The one on the left is him on a ship back to Canada, and on the right, it's when he's being reunited with his family. I believe it's his parents on the left and his wife on the right. You can see how she's linked her arm in there, and she's flicking the Distinguished Flying Cross that he was awarded. So, see what my guy won? Anyway, he served in the RAF during the war, but when he came back to Canada, he served for almost another 15 years in the RCAF as a pilot instructor and base commander, which is a really neat story. Another link to the people that service aircraft, and this one belongs to Marlene Shingleford. You can see her name embroidered there with a big number 7. This wasn't normal RCAF uniforms. You only got one of these uniforms if you served with that famous squadron, the Snowbirds. And she was a crew chief for number 7 of the Snowbirds, very distinguished career. She served postings overseas numerous times in the Persian Gulf, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. She's a chief warrant officer now, still serving in the RCAF, and just an entirely distinguished career. And I thought it was really important to have this to sort of signal the link between people today and people like Gordon Green that kept the machines flying back during the war, saying that these are the same jobs, these are the same skill sets. Now they can be done by men and women, which is such a, who knew? Who knew you couldn't do that in the Second World War? It's ridiculous. But that was just the sign of the times. But now women can do anything that men can do. Always could, but now they're allowed to do that. So that was why this is included in here. And we're going to end on this object. You can see the name. This is a run-of-the-mill, regular RCAF uniform. What's remarkable about this one is the wings you've got on there, astronaut wings. Not very many RCAF pilots who have that. And that uniform belongs to this man, who I'm sure you all know, Chris Hadfield, served as a fighter pilot in the Royal Canadian Air Force, subsequently joined the CSA, the Canadian Space Agency, and flew 3 missions off this planet. 2 on the space shuttle and 1 on a Soyuz on a mission where he commanded the ISS, the International Space Station. Really a remarkable career. Actually, I just finished reading his Astronaut's Guide to the Universe or whatever. Has anybody read that book? It's an amazing, amazing book. It's sort of 50% his memoirs talking about, it's kind of full of a lot of humble brag, but if anybody deserves it, it's him. Just a fantastic story of an overachiever. But then he teases out his lessons that are remarkable in how you can apply them to your own life. I haven't read a book in a long time where I learned that much from somebody. I highly recommend it. So there's the wings up in space. He flew CF-18s, fighter pilot. He was involved in one of the first interceptions of a Soviet bear over the Arctic in a CF-18. And quite remarkable because those same aircraft are intercepting those same bears, 40 years later, something like that. But yeah, quite an amazing story, and I think it's a good way to end on a sort of a happy story for the RCAF in terms of what their personnel can achieve. So the book is available for free on the internet. You can go home and download it. It's a free PDF thanks to the Government of Canada and the Royal Canadian Air Force. You don't have to worry about those links. Just Google 100 objects in RCAF and it'll pop up, no problem. They also have this book that's just been released on all of the aircraft that have served in the RCAF for the last 100 years. It's a really neat book, again, a free download. Just Google RCAF Centennial History Aircraft and you will find it. Again, really remarkable resources for the Air Force. That's all I have to say today, and I would love to take your questions if you have any.
Did the defense minister just announce a bunch of new airplanes for RCAF?
Yeah, they've sort of been dribbling in over the last few months. The F-35, what is it, the P-8, the naval four-engine.
Replace the Aurora?
Yeah, exactly. The drones, they're getting drones. There's something else.
A330s.
Yes, yeah, the A330s, which are already in service, 3 of them so far, I think. So yeah, really impressive replenishment.
Are any of them built in Canada?
Pieces of them, absolutely. Substantial pieces of them, that's part of any of the contracts the companies like. Yeah.
There's no letters. Is that purposeful?
It was purposeful. I wanted objects.
Okay.
There is one log, a pilot's log that I included in there, but for the most part they are physical objects that the story is about the object, not the story written on the object.
Which object gave you the biggest jolt when I assume you got to touch something?
I didn't know.
No,
This was kind of in the latter days of COVID, and frankly, I did all of this in my basement. Worked really closely with each of the museums, and this project was conceived to be bigger. It was supposed to be taking in all Canadian national museums, so the War Museum, the Canadian Aviation Space Museum, the Hamilton Military Heritage Museum, and I had conversations with all of them as well. But then the Air Force decided, no, we want to focus on our collections, which I wasn't happy with at the time, but I think it was the right decision. We're probably going to do another volume that's going to sort of get back to our original idea for it. But no, I worked really closely with each of the museums, and I had them send in a list, and most of them sent me like double or triple of what I actually used, and so I went through it and looked at the objects, and like I said, some of them I almost discarded. I'm sure there's remarkable stories that I didn't capture, but yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was really interesting projects. But I was going to say, material history isn't kind of the classic way of doing history. I had this talk with a museum curator up in Thunder Bay, and he said he does a similar project for his students that come through, where he'll take a Sykes Fairburn knife, you know, the commando knife, which is a very unique weapon. It's got a story of who uses it and how they use it. But he's not interested in that. He's interested in the material history of it. The metal that it's made out of, where that metal comes from. Is there a story about how that metal gets into it? Who makes it? The company that makes it, and it's just, to me, it really opened my eyes on the story these objects can tell. That it doesn't have to be what's obvious. You can sort of look beyond those obvious stories and find equally remarkable stories buried in them that tell their own tale. Yeah.
Every time I drive to Canadian Americans, I stop and pay homage to a Lancaster bomber that's located just east of Edmonton, New Brunswick.
It's not there anymore.
No,
Yeah, it's
They
in Trenton.
hope to unveil it on April 1st at Trenton. But now it's June 24th, they said they'll unveil it.
Yeah, they're far along in getting it resurrected, and I really like that they are keeping it in its post-war colors. So it's is it a wartime bomber? It certainly was.
It had 14 missions over Nazi Germany.
Yeah, and then it was changed out and did different missions in the
It did
Cold
20
War.
years in the high Arctic,
Yeah.
making maps that bettered or replaced Sir John Franklin's maps.
Yeah, I've got a story in the book about those Lancasters, which is neat. But yeah,
What are the chances of that airplane flying again?
zero.
Yeah.
Yeah, zero. No, it's not going to fly. That's not the mandate of the Trenton Museum. Probably the right decision. They don't have the money or they don't have the skills to do that. So no.
The individual engine on that plane is $250,000 plus.
Is there going to be room for it inside the Trenton Museum?
No, the longer term, medium term plans are to build a new building, so they can have the Halifax and Lancaster side by each.
I took pictures, on the trip down, I took pictures of that aircraft as they were disassembling it. And then on the way back, similar, so they were pretty steady on that.
Yeah, big job.
You know,
It took 8 flatbed transports to move it.
I still remember, I grew up in Dayton, and they brought the Hamilton Lank, was it Goderich? Somewhere out on Goderich, and I saw, they took the fuselage of it by a Chinook helicopter, and it flew right over my house, and I still remember that.
What happened to that Lancaster that used to be on the pillar down there by the exhibition show in Toronto? Remember that as a kid?
I think that one has been in a bunch of places. It was there was that Toronto Aviation Museum, but I think it's now found a new home out in BC somewhere, and they are working to restore it, not to fly, but to be displayed in a museum.
The other one I was going to ask you is about the legions, because they have a lot of weird objects in there. I don't think anybody's ever done a deep dive checking out legion by legion. There's a lot
No,
of stuff.
I'm sure it's remarkable what's there. I was talking with the RCMI in Toronto, the Royal Canadian Military Institute, because they've also got a remarkable collection, including objects from the Red Baron's aircraft, the seat with the bullet hole through it, and some
Is that the museum of that university?
University. Yeah, it used to be a beautiful building, and they tore it down and built a tower.
Didn't they put part of that museum into the tower?
Yeah. The RCMI is in there. I think they've got 2 or 3 floors in there, but it's not the beautiful place it was before.
Beautiful, yeah. A nice dining.
Yes, good place to eat.
So, it's obvious you're a good teacher, Mike. This is super enjoyable. How has this changed your approach to teaching history compared to when you and I were kids or when we were starting out? Or has it?
I don't know that this project has changed the way that I teach, because I think the way I teach has changed quite a bit from 20 years ago. It used to always be kind of like a master and student, and very much of almost a one-way dialogue. You talk to the class, they write it down. Now it's much more of a dialogue, a discussion, bringing them along with the story. This project fit really well into where I am as a historian right now, in that I think that history needs to tell stories. It needs to be interesting and accessible and enjoyable, that you have to find the humanity in it, that you can tell the story of all these objects for the RCAF as an institution and have absolutely no soul and no character, but you can also tell it in a way that's engaging, that makes you read it and go, wow, that's amazing, I want to know more. And I really hope that the way I teach history, the way I write history, is that kind of an approach. Because I've been doing this a long time, and I've spent far too many hours reading stuff that puts me to sleep, doesn't engage me, doesn't encourage me. And my absolute hope is that this is the kind of a topic that you go away and you like, I need to read this book now. I want to find more of these stories. I want to understand it. Or find other stories that capture your attention. Because I know I've always been like that as a student, that if I hear a lecture or watch a program or see a movie and it's done right the next day or even that afternoon, you're off trying to find out more and learn bigger stories, more in depth than it's there. And I think if history is done right, that's what's going to happen. If it's done poorly, you're going to go home and think, oh, why the hell did I just waste an hour with this guy? It's like, what a flippin' waste of time. I hope none of you go away feeling that.
In the movie about the bombers that went after the dams in Germany, there's not a word of Canada. The word Canada never showed up in that movie. And
No.
yet, most of those crews were trained in Canada.
You can talk about that. Oh, of course they were in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. You can say the same with what's the D-Day movie with John Wayne? It's like D-Day told without Band of Brothers. It's like you can go down the list. If we don't tell our story, nobody else is going to do it for us. And we've got Passchendaele. It's kind of the high watermark of telling Canadian military history. But Tim Cook, who I think you know is a good friend of mine, he wrote a review of Passchendaele, and he said it was too much passion, not enough Passchendaele. Maybe that's the most succinct
But
review.
didn't Ronald Reagan talk about the Canadian troops landing on Juno when he was at the American?
Ronald Reagan, love him or hate him, gave one of the great speeches in Normandy. Just hit all the right marks, all the right tones, included everybody. Yeah, it was a really impressive speech. I've actually included it in some of the things I've written.
The Great Escape's another bozo movie.
Yeah, there was no Americans there. There's no Americans there. But
They were
Hollywood
in another
needs them.
camp, they weren't there. Well, there was about 2 or 3, but they were flying with the RAF, so they were there. Yeah.
Netflix just finished a special on the air war.
Who did they?
And they mentioned Canada phenomenon.
What's
The contribution of education that we get here that brought. The fact that even during the Battle of Britain, the shortage of pilots, a great percentage of them were Canadians. They really paid homage. I was very
Well, if I was asked what Canada's greatest contribution to the Second World War was, I wouldn't even give it a second thought. It was the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan.
still.
That program trained and prepared 141,000 pilots, navigators, bombardiers that were a substantial proportion of the airmen that flew in the British flying services in the Second World War. And not only was it a program that gave to the war effort, it was a program that gave back to Canada in so many ways in terms of building airfields, building infrastructures, and building people that could run them, instructors, air traffic controllers, people that did aviation logistics, things that paid off in spades after the war and made sure that Canadian aviation led the industry in so many different ways. So,
Given what you just said, my understanding now is aviators are no longer going to be trained in Canada.
yeah.
This next generation. Have you heard anything?
Yeah. It's actually 419 Squadron in Cold Lake. We stood down. They flew the advanced fighter lead-in trainers. So the Hawk. The Hawk is clapped out. It's maxed in their hours. The RCAF Hawks have more hours on them than any comparable airframes in the world, so they have to be retired. But also they're not suitable as a lead-in advanced trainer for the F-35. We need a new aircraft that does that. The Americans have an ad hoc solution, but they're bringing on a new plane. The Italians, the Poles, and somebody else have a fighter that they're using as the lead into the F-35, but none of them are ideal solutions. So we're still doing pilot training, we're still doing initial training, we're still doing training for helicopters and twin engine and for the bigger the Hercs and the C5s and everything like that.
So Moonshot's still active. but
Yeah,
it's-
yeah, partly in this job. So we're still doing all that. We're just not doing the advanced fighter training. That's being contracted out to the Americans, to the Italians, and somewhere else that I can't remember right now. But it's only a temporary solution until we get a new aircraft in Canada that can serve as the lead-in for the F-35. So we're not done with fighter training. It's just on pause right now.
What about Goose Bay, where all those foreign fighter pilots were trained?
Yeah, they don't do that as much anymore.
There's a lot of complaints from the indigenous people.
Yeah, well, that was kind of a Cold War artifact in that, European Air Forces needed a place to train low level because that was the way that strikes were going to take place on the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union at the time. Low altitude to evade air defenses and so forth. And obviously you can't do that anywhere in Europe and have the space, so it was done in Labrador and very effectively. But no, that's pretty much all shut down now.
There's a British bomber there at the museum in Goose Bay. It got there by accident. It was on its way to the United States to become a monument in a SAC base in the United States. It caught fire over the Atlantic, and the emergency landing in Goose Bay. And they fixed it, but the British said, we don't want it back here.
Oh, it's still there?
It's still in Goose Bay.
How many?
It's the meanest looking airplane you've ever seen.
Is that a Victor?
Is that, which one were we
Vulcan?
Vulcan.
Vulcan, yeah.
So the other objects that you didn't talk about, which one is your favorite of them and why? Or which two or three would be your favorites and why?
It took every ounce of my, not to include a RAF uniform from 1918 that I included in the book with a picture of Raymond Collishaw, because he's somebody I've written about, and I'm not going to talk about him because I talk about him every other time. So I made a conscious decision not to do that here. There is a Genie missile it's in the museum in Quebec, and it's the Genie missile was a nuclear missile that was equipped CF-101s during the Cold War, meant to be fired. It was not a missile, it was a rocket because it was unguided, designed to be fired into Soviet bomber forces to obliterate them because you couldn't necessarily catch them, and with the size, they thought nuclear weapons were the best way. So there's a Genie rocket that's in the museum, and that's kind of cool. What else is there?
Wasn't there a Beaumont up in North Bay for years?
I think it was there for years. I'm not sure it's there anymore.
Those weren't, it's still there.
Is it still there? Those were never owned by the RCAF.
Yeah.
They were sort of leased, borrowed, operated by, and the Americans took a lot of them back.
It's like our own strong.
Yes. Yeah, and the nuclear depth charges and everything like that. Don't ever let anybody tell you Canada was not a nuclear power. We were up to it in our eyeballs. It's just we flew the missions and had platforms to launch them, but it was all American weapons. So.
What Canadian airplane did they call the Widowmaker?
I think that was the CF-104.
And why?
It was a tough plane to fly, although it was designed as a high altitude, high speed interceptor, but the Canadians used it for low level tactical reconnaissance and nuclear bomb delivery, which is not what it was designed for.
Conventional bombs.
Pardon?
Conventional bombs.
Yeah, and so we kind of flew it outside of what the aircraft should have been doing. I love when I see stats about how the Spanish Air Force flew it and had a really low loss rate and low casualties, and then they say the Americans, the Canadians and the Germans flew the same plane and had these horrendous casualty rates, which is true, but the Spanish only did high altitude interception and didn't fly them much. The Canadians and the new Luftwaffe were flying them hard and often and say recklessly at times, not recklessly in terms of the pilots performing badly, but reckless in terms of pushing the missions they were asked to fly. So comes at a cost.
In the creation of this, did you have a list in your head of what you wanted? Was it fulfilled? Were you holding out for something that didn't materialize?
The big thing I didn't get was the War Museum and Canadian Aviation Space Museum and those, because I kind of, and then that happened sort of maybe halfway into the project, so I ended up having to take a bunch of objects that I wanted to use and backfill them with other objects. And that's actually the big reason why I ended up having two co-collaborators with me, Dr. Main and Dr. St. Croix, because they kind of pulled the rug out from under me, and then we had to get this out in time for the centennial and stuff, so I needed help getting that finished up. So they ended up probably doing about 35% of about 35 objects in the book, which was a big help. But then it took a lot of work to rewrite them, so the book was in one voice instead of three. You know, that works. So I never had a problem of having to cut items in the end that I really wanted. It was more finding suitable objects to fit. We've got a Tilly hat, the classic Tilly hat that was worn by the Canadian Fighter Squadron leader in the desert, the first Gulf War, which I think is really iconic, telling that story. And there's a Scudbusters t-shirt it was like a homemade t-shirt about sort of having to dance around the scuds that were incoming where the Canadians were posted up there, which is kind of neat. So, yeah, it goes, the first object in the book is I said I didn't include aircraft, but there are 2 aircraft in there. One is the silver dart replica that's in Trenton, because I think that's really iconic as the first aircraft that flew in Canada, and then also the Burgess Dunn, which was the float plane that was used by the Canadian Aviation Corps in 1914. There's a reproduction of that also in Trenton that I included because I think that's an essential story. It did a good job of letting me tell that story. So.
And that floating boat that everybody had on the screen, is there any of those in Canada?
There are. There's one that's flying out of Hamilton. Yeah. There's another one that I just learned about when I was up in Thunder Bay that was ex-RCAF, was doing water bombing and ended up crashing up in Northwest Territories somewhere. They found it, they rescued it, they brought it down the river on a barge, they got it flying again. And this summer it's going on a cross-Canada tour, sort of in honor of both the RCAF centennial and the fact that they've got this aircraft flying again. So not only is it flying, they can do water landings with it, which I don't think the Hamilton one can do. So I may be wrong.
Have you ever turned your mind to doing what Canada turned out during the Second World War as far as munitions, aircraft, tanks, you name it, we did it. 12 million people.
Funny you mention that. If I got $1 for every project I wanted to write about, I'd have been able to retire a long time ago. But one of the projects I really desperately want to do is a story about aircraft manufacturing in Canada during the Second World War, because I think it's a really fantastic story. It's in some ways a story of branch plants, because we didn't really have a domestic aviation. We'd had elements of it, but not a big one. But we made a lot of aircraft here. Up in, like I said, going back to Thunder Bay was Canadian Car and Foundry, Elsie McGill, making Hurricanes, as the British like to say, Harvards after the war, the Helldiver, stuff like that, Lancaster at Malton, Mosquito at Malton, other aircraft in Quebec. Fascinating story. We did everything except make engines pretty much during the war. And nobody's really told that story. There's a PhD dissertation that was done a few years ago that the guy wrote, and it's now sitting in an archive. It's never been published anywhere. But it needs a bigger story. So it's a part of our history, part of the good news story that we need more of.
About the Admiral Arrow.
I'm not talking about the Admiral. We almost had fisticuffs in Thunder Bay when somebody mentioned it, and yeah, it was ugly, so I'm not talking about the Arrow.
Figured you were avoiding it for a reason.
There was a B-17, American B-17 coming back from Europe after the war, 1948, and it ran it on Christmas Eve in the headlands, and it ran out of fuel over Labrador. So they saw an open lake on Christmas Eve. The lakes are frozen in Labrador.
Mhm.
And they thought, oh, there's a place to land on that frozen lake. So they put it down, and the props got in, and everything was fine. The crew got out, and the RCMP came and got them the next day and got them out. And that, so the U.S. Air Force came up to get the airplane later that year. Well, the next year, Christmas Eve, the plane went down. They come up at 8 hours to get the airplane, and they go to the lake, and it's gone.
Same, yeah.
They
Still
thought it
has been.
sank. So they put down divers to find it in the lake, and they couldn't find it anywhere. So the U.S. Air Force just wrote it off. It's after the war. Who cares? But there's a guy in Georgia that rebuilds warbirds. His father was a tail gunner on the B-17. He desperately wanted a B-17 someplace. And he searched all over the world to get them. There's two or three, there's very few of them, two or three, and none of them worked. And he heard about the one up in Labrador. So he hired the crew that found the southern, during the American Civil War, the submarine.
Oh, yeah.
The Hummer. He hired that crew to go to Labrador and find the B-17. And they looked for months and couldn't find it. And somebody finally said, well, why don't we ask the locals? They know anything about it. They went to an Eskimo and they said, I don't know if they called him an Eskimo, they called him an Eskimo in those days. And they said, we're looking for an airplane that might be, he said, oh, yeah, it's over in that lake over there. How do you know? Well, the only lake up here in Labrador where I put my line down and I can't get the damn thing back, it catches on something. So we got to go up, and there's the B-17. After like 70 years down at the bottom of it. So they raised it up with airbags and all, got it up to the surface. Then they got to take it 106 kilometers, maybe miles, through whitewater rivers to get it to the nearest road, so they can put it on a flatbed truck. And they did that. And when they got it up on the truck, a guy shows up from Ottawa with a piece of paper that says, that's a Canadian artifact. You cannot take it out of the country. So the guy from Georgia fought it for a year, went to court in Newfoundland, luckily, and the judge said, now let me get this straight. It was an American crew bringing an American airplane back to America, and they had to crash land in Canada to save their lives, and you say that's a Canadian airplane? The judge said, take your airplane, gentlemen, and go home. And it went and being rebuilt in Georgia today.
Oh, cool.
And one of the places where he looked for B-17 was on Greenland.
No, I've heard that story.
Buried under the ice.
Yeah.
And E-38 station.
That's right, and it was like 250 feet of ice on top of the airplane. And when they got down to it, it was squeezed so tight they couldn't use it. But it had the 250 caliber machine guns on the one on the top of the cockpit. And he brought those home. And one of them had a bit of a bend to it, so he didn't fire it. The other one was fine, so they fired it, and tracer bullets came out from 1942. This is like, I read about these things from
That's great.
and it was 92 or something like that. No, it was 2002 they fired, and those tracer bullets came out from 1942.
Well, I think we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Mike. It was a fascinating talk, and I'm going to be reading the next 90 stories.
Yeah.
And I'm sure everyone else is going to pick up on it. So thanks again for ending our series. I just want to let you know that we will be starting up again with our lecture series in September. I have my October lecture booked, and our speakers here. It's Bill McVie, and he's going to talk on the Canadian engineers' role in the evacuation of Market Garden. I was going to have him come in September, but that's when the anniversary is, and he's going to be over there. So,
He hopes to be over there.
So hopefully I see you back here in the fall, and thank you all for coming out tonight.
Thanks, Mike.
We got a couple of minutes.
Oh, God.